Hello and welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. Today, I want to discuss with you several articles that appeared in the online publication uh, EOS, and the topic is plastic pollution. Now, I have covered this issue with you numerous times over the years I've been posting videos on my channel. And needless to say, it's becoming, it already has been a major problem. It's only getting worse. So, in this first one here, we're going to discuss what's going on in the Mediterranean Sea. And as we see from the title here, seafloor plastic pollution is not going anywhere. The amount of microplastics at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea is growing as global production increases and plastic breakdown is halted. Okay, so here we see some sediment core samples collected near the Ebro Delta, looking for traces of microplastics over the decades. They're going down, looking into the past to document, measure, quantify the amount of plastic uh, deposition and hence pollution. The world produces about 380 million metric tons of plastic annually. Much of that plastic debris ends up in the world's oceans, rivers, lakes in the form of microplastics, which contaminate the ecosystems, threatens the well-being of animals and humans. I did a video, documenting how we have plastic in our blood. I've shown videos of larval fish ingesting microplastic particles. So it's a problem. Plastics are found in all the oceans, from the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the Marianas Trench. It's everywhere. So this study here that I'm going to do a quick synopsis of looked at what's going on in the Mediterranean Sea. Researchers found that the mass of particles that have settled to the seafloor mimics global plastic production over the past 5 decades. Once buried in sediment, the study found, microplastics remain intact. Microplastics are very difficult, plastics in general are very difficult to break down. Scientists have examined sediment cores for a long time. Sediment cores basically drill into the substrate, you pull up basically a cylinder of material, and you analyze it. And of course, they're looking here at plastics, but you can look at forams, you can do isotopic fractionation studies. There's a whole bunch of different things that can be done with sediment cores, ice cores, tree cores, and so forth. You get a lot of information that way. Cores they found provide a timeline of the plastic age, as they are referring to it, which is starting in the 1950s when plastics began being produced on an industrial scale. Remember, plastic is a product of fossil fuel. Keep that in mind. Plastics fill half a century of Mediterranean sediments. In the new study, researchers collected more than 10 cores from the seafloor of the Balearic Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean, near the Ebro Delta, where one of Spain's longest rivers enters the sea. The spot where the cores were collected, about 100 meters below the surface, concentrates pollution discharged by the river, including plastic debris from bags, vessel paint, clothes, cosmetics, and other sources. So they took these cores and they made 1 centimeter thick discs, and then they used isotopic dating of lead naturally present in the sediments to estimate the age of 5 cores. Each slice encapsulated about 10 years of history. So you pull up this sediment and you make slices along the length of it, each corresponding, to a certain decade as you move further in the past. The deeper you go in the sediments, the older the sample is. The best preserved core contained sediments from 1965. They used spectrometers identifying the molecules to measure the size and composition of the microplastics present. And they were able to measure this down to 11 micrometers or micron. A micron is 10 to the minus 6 meters, and 11 microns is about the size of a red blood cell. So what did they found? They found that the mass of microplastics in the seafloor sediments had tripled in the past 20 years, and its accumulation followed the same trend observed in global plastic production. Among the most common plastics were polyethylene, polypropylene, polyester. Polyester as in polyester clothing. And Michael Grillaud said that we were surprised that the results fit so well with the global production. He is a paleoceanographer at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain. The fact that we impact our environment is clear. We are capable of doing things that last thousands of years, but at the same time, in less than 70 years, we kind of messed the works up. The study was published in Environmental Science and Technology. It adds to our knowledge and understanding of the plastic problem. Loret, who was not involved, Javier Loret was not involved in the study, and he's out of Woods Hole, said that it provides evidence of contamination for a new kind of environment. All these depositional environments worldwide are telling us the same story. Pollution is here to stay. Plastic pollution is not going away. Although considerable, the level of contamination documented near the Ebro Delta is considered intermediate. Previous studies have shown higher plastic concentration in other parts of the world, even other parts of the Mediterranean, such as the Tyrrhenian Sea off the west coast of Italy. For Grillaud, the study's most significant result is that the plastic in the cores did not show signs of breaking down. Degradation happens when there is light or heat. We don't have those in the sediments at the bottom of the sea, where it's dark and cold. Plastics can take anywhere from 20 to 400 years to decompose, depending on the environmental conditions, also depending on the specific chemical species comprising the material. Microplastics have been found in the air, water, soil, and even living organisms, including people. Remember, I referenced earlier, plastics are in our blood. And talk about microplastics. There's also the issue of nanoplastics, which can actually get inside tissues and cells and that sort of stuff. In the ocean, plastic pollution is expected to quadruple by 2050, according to a 2022 meta-analysis from the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. This is the same group that includes the PIK group. Scientists are still assessing the impacts of microplastics on ecosystems and human health. There are indications that microplastics can harm organisms by accumulating in organ, for physically blocking processes such as feeding, causing cell death, messing with for example, in the thyroid, messing with metabolism, causing immune issues. I posted videos on this discussing some of the physiological problems that can result from having plastics in our systems. So this is now documenting the amount of plastics that are accumulating, and the amount is expected to only increase like everything else. And of course, with ever increasing human population, more and more people will be using the plastic product. The demand is there to make more of this stuff, but it would just only exacerbate the problem. So, move on to the next quick article. Again, also in EOS. And Rivers are a highway for microplastics into the ocean. Because a question that has arisen is, how does the plastic find its way into the ocean? New research shows that rivers are a main road, or a major contributor for most of the plastic pollution that gets into the ocean, including microplastics. Okay, so let's scroll down here a bit. Okay, and here now is a photo of the Ebro Delta that we just finished discussing. And it's one of the largest rivers on the Iberian Peninsula. And we have just shown how plastics have accumulated there for at least 5 decades. Microplastics are everywhere, from remote mountaintop glaciers to human guts to Mariana's Trench, and anything and everywhere in between, including places you probably would never have considered. In aquatic environments, microplastics have been a known pollutant since the 1970s, when several studies found large quantities of synthetic fibers and plastic fragments in the North Atlantic Ocean. Little has been known about where they originated. For a long time, researchers thought they were fragments from larger plastic objects that broke off at sea, but recent studies shown that reality might be more complex. Like, that's really a surprise? And again, we're referencing the folks at Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain. They measured the concentration, right? We just discussed that. They also and they documented how it was accumulating in the sediment cores. The researchers looked also for microplastics in surface waters along the sandy beaches near the delta and the sediments at the bottom of the estuary. And basically, what their findings confirm is that rivers are a major means to bring microplastics, into the ocean. At a rate of 3.5 particles per cubic meter of water, the Ebro River dumps 2.2 billion pieces of microplastic into the Mediterranean Sea every year. Think about that. 2.2 billion pieces of microplastic into the Mediterranean every year. And this number that is being cited here is probably a medium to low ball estimate, especially when compared to other rivers in Europe and elsewhere. In extreme cases of heavily polluted rivers near densely populated areas, such as the Pearl River Delta near Guangzhou in China, researchers recently reported concentrations ranging from 379 to almost 8,000 pieces per cubic meter of surface water. Up to 8,000 pieces per cubic meter. In the Seine River near Paris, another study reported 3 to 108 particles per cubic meter in 2015, and it's probably only safe to assume that number is higher in 2023. The new study is one of the few that demonstrates a global picture of microplastic distribution in river estuaries, which are key transition zones between freshwater systems and marine systems. Most studies report concentration in surface water or sediments or in the seafront of the river, but it's really hard to make a global diagnostic of the situation with that approach, said Laura Simon Sanchez, a researcher and doctoral student at that Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. And she's also the lead author, and she's associated with the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology. Simone Sanchez and her colleagues found that microplastics tend to accumulate in sediments at the bottom of the delta, where in the Ebro they found a mean concentration of 2,052 particles per kilogram of sediment. Prevailing currents can also transport many particles that wash ashore on beaches north of the delta. On these beaches, the team found around 400 particles per kilogram of sand. And this work was published in the Science of the Total Environment. We've seen that bottom sediments are clearly where most plastics accumulate, but we think that storms can remobilize them and push them out to sea. And then they want to see how long they persist and so forth. So, question is, where do they come from? Well, not too many studies have actually looked at the mechanisms by which this can happen. So, Martin Wagner, who is an environmental toxicologist at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, states the problem is that everybody is so concerned about microplastics and plastic pollution in marine systems. We have little knowledge about microplastic contamination in freshwater systems. He was not involved in the Ebro study, by the way. Well, researchers finally realized that all the plastic pollution is principally coming from land-based sources. So it makes sense to look at the rivers first. Excuse me. Overall, 70% of the microplastics found in the Ebro River Delta are synthetic fibers, followed by plastic fragments and films. Simone Sanchez thinks that these fibers probably come from domestic and commercial laundry that wastewater treatment plants fail to remove. Wagner disagrees and points out that there are many diffuse sources and probably even more fibers reach the rivers through their surface than from wastewater. According to Wagner, it will be very hard to reduce the amount of synthetic fibers in the rivers unless more studies look into how they get there in the first place. Here's your challenge. Even without knowing how these particles get into rivers, it's becoming clear that rivers are not only the first transport road for plastic pollution, but also an important sink for plastic pollution. And here we have some photos showing synthetic fibers comprising about 70% of the microplastics in the Ebro River. And you can see, that's a synthetic fiber particle, as is this here, this here, this as well, this as well. All this other stuff here, this is matrix material. So this would be sediment material. But you can clearly see this. And for scale here, this little line is about 100 microns. Okay, so this is about maybe 400 microns, most likely, in total length or something like that. About maybe 200, 250 microns. Okay? So it gives you a little bit of idea of the scale. The process of accumulation and degradation of microplastics in river settlement are still poorly understood. Little is known about how they affect aquatic life and maybe human health. Well, if organisms ingest this, that's not going to be good for them. I mean, we've even hearing situations where a whale washes up on a beach. They do a necropsy, open up the stomach, and find plastic in it. We're talking things like plastic water bottles, very large plastic items that the whales have ingested, and they basically chokes off their the gastrointestinal tract. They starve because they think they have a full stomach, but they're starving to death. It's it has very bad implications for ecosystems. And so now, related to this, how are microplastics transported to polar regions? New modeling indicates that global subsurface ocean currents distribute submerged microplastics along very different routes than those traveled by floating plastic debris. Okay, let's take a look at that. I will return to this figure after we discuss some of the text here. But this is a very interesting figure here. In recent years, the prevalence of plastics in the world's oceans has become a major environmental issue. Drinking straws, water bottles to single use plastic bags, much smaller particles, up to 12.7 million metric tons of plastic waste are dumped into the oceans each year, with devastating consequences for seabirds, marine wildlife, and, of course, potential harmful effects on human health. Right? Seabirds ingest this, as I just discussed. Cetaceans or pinnipeds can ingest, maybe even sharks, what have you, other fish. Because ocean currents can carry this waste thousands of kilometers from where it enters the water, plastic pollution has quickly become a global issue. Debris, including microplastics, which are defined as less than 5 millimeters across, and nanoplastics are on the order of basically 10 to the minus 9 meters. So it's even smaller than the microplastics. So these debris have been found at the poles, in sea ice, and then you're all familiar with the sea surface garbage patches, which is trapped by the oceanic gyres, right? You have the big, oceans. In the middle of the oceans, you tend to have a big gyre that's a big convergence zone in the middle, and the big plastic bits are concentrated there. Think of the Great Pacific garbage patch. Although transport models have successfully described the distribution of microplastic observed floating on the ocean surface, these buoyant bits account for a small fraction of the total expected plastics volume. Turbulent mixing, biofouling, and a decrease in particle size appear to cause a large proportion of microplastics to sink. But what happens to these particles deeper in the water column, and whether they can account for the prevalence of plastic in the polar region, is not yet known. So Wickman et al. Have assessed how subsurface currents disperse microplastics. Using the Parcells framework, the team modeled the trajectories of 1 million virtual microplastic particles around the globe over a 10-year period. After running the same simulations for 4 types of particles located at depths ranging from the surface to 120 meters, the researchers compared the resulting microplastic distribution and their transport pathways between different oceanic regions. The results indicate that submerged microplastics are controlled by different dynamics and therefore follow very different routes than particles found floating on the surface. The simulations suggest that near surface currents carry large quantities of microplastics from subtropical and subpolar regions toward the poles, a finding that may explain why this material is commonly detected even in those remote regions. In addition to presenting a plausible explanation for how microplastics can be transported from low latitudes to Earth's polar region, the study offers insights into subsurface oceanic transport as well as the distribution of plastic particles in marine ecosystems. Okay, let's take a look at that diagram. First, a little description what it is. These diagrams show model plastic particle concentration in the oceans after 10 simulated years, starting from an initial uniform distribution over the entire globe. A, that's the figure on the left here. It's A, right? A is at the surface. Particles tend to accumulate in the subtropical gyres, the garbage patches, whereas large parts of the polar regions are depleted. Particles that move at a fixed depth of 120 meters do not show such accumulation zones, and high concentrations are still visible everywhere in the polar region. and that is B. So Z is equal to 0 meters. Z is what we use to indicate vertical depth in the ocean. So Z equals 0 means the surface. Z equals 120 means 120 meters down. So this is the number of particles per BLN, billion. Okay? So the blue is 10 to the 0 or 1. Then you have 10 to the first, 10 squared, 10 cubed, 10 to the fourth. So when you get into the yellow, we're talking 10,000 particles per billion. So what are they saying? Here are your gyres right here. You got all the oceanic gyres here, and we see right there, that's the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. We can see that the gyres at the surface accumulate a lot of the plastics. Now when we get to here, we see almost a uniform distribution, and that is pretty much around the vicinity of about 100 particles per billion. That's substantial. It gets a little higher towards the coastal regions here, most likely probably due to Ekman upwelling processes, but you can see that it is into the Arctic Ocean around the Southern Ocean. What's interesting is that where it's a little lesser, right here, this is where you find the equatorial countercurrent. So you have a gyre on this side and a gyre on this side. So probably the physical processes, even down to 120 meters, are such that the concentration is a little less. Don't forget the gyres, the effects, you have what's called the Ekman spiral. So the effects can reach several hundred meters down in the gyres. So bear that in mind. So what we're showing here is that the concentration of plastic is increasing. Right? We have a possible new mechanisms for how it's being distributed all over the place. Some float, some sink. Okay. Some, if an organism ingests it, for example, and they defecate, well, the plastic can be found in the fecal material, and that sinks all the way down to the ocean sediment. We call that marine snow, by the way. So that's another mechanism to transport the plastic to the sediment. Then they get, like everything else, it gets compacted, and then you go there, you get a core, and then you find it there, and you can analyze it. But having, some of the values I read earlier, up to 8,000 particles per cubic meter, and so many per kilogram, and so on and so forth, it shows you how ubiquitous this problem is. And it's related to, of course, the ever increasing processing of fossil fuels to make the plastic in the first place. And organisms ingesting it, ruining their physiology, getting into the ecosystem, ruining the ecosystem. And the other problem is that more and more people on the planet, placing more and more demands for such particles. That's why we need to get away from the one-use plastic containers or what have you. When you go grocery shopping, bring a canvas bag with you. That can be reused numerous amounts of time, as opposed to those plastic bags. Things like that. Major problem. As I said, I have documented this for you in other videos. Think of this as kind of an update. It's getting worse. That's the bottom line. It's not just what we see at the surface. It's throughout the water column. It's in the sediments. It's in organisms. It's in ecosystems. It's in us. Thank you for your time. We'll talk soon.